Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome all the panelists. Welcome to all the participants. It's a great pleasure, for me to interact with all of you on this very important matter. And thanks to the conference organizers for bringing us together and giving me the opportunity to organize and chair this session. So we are very happy to be joined by very important, nice guests who are who are practitioners who have a great idea about the topic which we are going to deal with in this session, which is on administrative and research issues on land matters. So basically, we have been seeing land conflicts are on the rise, and there have been several institutional changes which are being brought to regularize the land sectors and several reforms. A lot of these are federal, a lot of these are at the state level, and as we know, they get implemented at a very granular, unit, which is the panchayat, the village, the urban, you know, uh, parcels and pockets. So we are standing at the cusp of immense complexity as we talk about the land sector, which includes different stakeholders with their different incentives, different preference functions, so to say. So we are here to spend the next 90 minutes or so in trying to understand some of those complexities and to see what are the practical problems and the solutions, and where we can move forward from here. So I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Sajid Babu, who is a district collector of Kasargod, Kerala. Ms. Sushila Bhatt, only talking about the panelists, who's an advocate of at the High Court of Kerala. Mr. Sumindranathan R, who is a technocrat, software advisor, and architect, works with the Karnataka State Natural Disaster Monitoring Center. Mr. Harichandan, who is working deep and actively in the and working on land records frauds, and Ms. Seema Mundoli, who is an assistant professor at Azim Premji University. I am Ranjan Ghosh. I teach and work at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. We have a Center for Management in Agriculture here, and we have a School of Public Policy. We have a Public Systems group here. So many centers in the School of Management here, which is directly or indirectly linked to property rights and institutions of natural resources such as land. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome. I will request now Dr. Sajid Babu to present his views, and then we will move forward in the order of the panelists.
Good afternoon, Dr. Ranjan Gomar and my fellow speakers in the session. In fact, I'm not the district collector of Kasargod now. I have been posted as a commissioner of civil supplies now. So I'm at Trivandrum right now.
Okay.
Basically, I've been dealing with land matters since I joined the revenue department in 2006. Since then, I have been involved in so many land litigations, land inquiries, and all those things. What I would feel is that there is no specific law in India which says somebody is the owner of the land. So not even a single law is there in any parts of India, either in the state or in the union, that somebody is the owner of the land. What we do is, we presumptively think that somebody is the owner. Presumptive. We call it as a presumptive titling. So we usually, in all the governments, even central government is not recognizing any land right in any parts of India, but the state governments do recognize some land rights, but only on a local this thing. That's why I said it is only on a presumptive basis. So what sort of presumptive things are there in the land title domain? First thing is, if somebody wants to buy a land or sell a land, it starts with the basic cardinal principle that caveat emptor principle. Caveat emptor principle is the major principle. That says, let the buyer beware. That is caveat emptor principle. Now that becomes the duty of the buyer to see that whether the land which is going to purchase is viable or not. And what we are as a state machinery, or as an administrator, what we have done to educate the people on the alienability of a piece of land. We are not educating the people. Now we are putting the onus on the person who is investing money on the land. That is highly, no, it is, no, I don't know what word I can use for that. We are not teaching the people about the land laws, and we are letting the people to know whether a land is viable or not. That is, no, as per the recommendation in the Millennium Development Goals, once the land become a commodity or something which is seamlessly saleable or seamlessly transferable, then only investment will come. I don't know at what age we are going to get good investment on a piece of land. Because even now, governments are not serious about how to bring in a law which can help the buyer to and ensure the buyer that this land is saleable or not. Unfortunately, that law has not been passed in any of the state governments or in the union government, because even there is a confusion whether land is a union subject or a concurrent subject or a state subject. Again, there is a big confusion on that. So the land is a precious resource, and still we are highly confused about who should control the land. Now again, one more thing, as per the state reorganization order and as per the constitution, the entire entire land piece in India belongs to the union government. But there are, and union government is requesting state government for getting a land for their purposes, like, for establishing a union government office or something. So there are utter confusion in the entire administrative setup in India. That is with respect to public properties. And coming to the private properties, again this confusion is only we are depending on the presumptive titling. There is an act called the 1908 Registration Act. That particular act says, even if you want to sell our secretariat or the national highway, you can sell it. Provided, you just need to pay the stamp duty for it. So such a confusing law is there for the registration of a property. And after registration of the property, in our state there is a law called Transfer Registry Rules of 1966. That particular rule says even if the land tenure, land title is changed in your name, that will not confer a title upon you, and this is just for the purpose of fiscal, that is just for paying the tax. Again, confused. Then there is encumbrance certificate, nil encumbrance certificate. That says even your name is coming in that if some liabilities is there in the particular piece of land, that will not reflect upon any of the government record unless and until you make a registration there. Like some properties having 10 lakh liability on a particular piece of property, but it will not reflect like a bank loan due. It will not reflect upon any of the land records kept in the government offices. And if somebody is going to buy that particular property, he may not be aware whether that particular property is having a liability or not. And there are n number of inhibitions, prohibitions on a piece of land. Like in our state, we cannot buy land belonging to the STs. And there is an act called Kerala Land Assessment Act of 1960, wherein a land which is given by the government to a person, that cannot be sold for 12 years. Like there are n number of prohibition on piece of land, and the rights and interests of the the private persons and the public persons on a piece of land. Again, there are n number of things. So ultimately, what I would suggest is for India to develop, and again to make more investment on land, like it is envisaged in the Millennium Development Goals, we need to have clear titles on the land. Unfortunately, those kind of titling law is not there in India. And in fact, in 2011, there was a move by Government of India, and Government of India brought in a land titling bill of 2011. Unfortunately, based on Government of India cannot bring in an act as the land is still there is a confusion on under which category it belongs. So Government of India brought in an act in 2011, not act, it is a bill 2011 land titling bill. But based on that, now states should have formulated new titling acts. But unfortunately, that has not happened so far, even after 10 years of that particular enactment. So like that, it is for a person who wants to invest on a piece of land, there are n number of issues uh, faced. We, through these type of conferences, what I would suggest, there should be good amount of discussion on such topics, and that these things should be brought to the notice of the persons who are the legislators, who can make changes in the system, or who can bring in new laws in the system. Then only some changes will happen. And again, another issue: if you bring in uh, some laws, that should cater the needs of all the people. Like, if other than Kerala, in Kerala, what happens is, we follow a particular type of settlement pattern. It's called homestead type of settlement pattern. And in other parts of India, they follow the hamlet type of settlement pattern. And in the homestead type of settlement pattern, you cannot find a city area which is not being controlled by revenue department. In other parts of India, what we see is the hamlets become a panchayat, and the panchayat develop into a municipality and a corporation. And outside that periphery, the entire land belongs to, that can be controlled by the revenue department of the state. But in Kerala, each bit of land is being controlled by revenue department as well as the LSG. So that is the system here. So if government of India wants to bring in some changes in the system, there should be good deliberation with the states, and then only some good changes will happen in the system. That's my opinion about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Babu, for very nicely, crisply articulating, the reason why we have this, very complex institutional interplay where there are so many conflicting institutions. One law, there are confusions over different kinds of laws over the same jurisdiction, and that potentially leading to, different interpretations and therefore different, complexity. So, I will just ask from your experience, how do you think, because there is an element of functionality. So what I presume is that when there is so much formality and so much conflict, there are informalities inherently which lead to some kind of an working equilibrium. You see, for example, if there is a two different laws on and there is a conflicted property, probably you would be the one who would be going there and taking making a judgment at an informal level. So there is a functionality to that. So do you think that it is because that the formal setup cannot bring in that functionality, is that it lacks a potential credibility, and because of which there is a lack of will to change those.
Yeah, nice question. Actually, see, if you see the laws in the on land in India and in various states, you would find that an administrator
Yeah.
or the executing officer cannot take a final decision on any of the legal matters,
Yeah.
like civil matters.
Yeah.
See, everything ends up in a court of law. And what happens in court of law, you may be knowing, because if you see the total number of cases pending in courts in Kerala, and even in India, you would find that see, most of these cases, about more than 70% of the cases are of civil nature, and you see the number of disposals in our courts, it is very, very low. And that is why, see, even if you start a civil dispute, you can say that your third generation will end up getting a decree from that particular court.
Correct.
So again, that's why I'm saying, if you can replace that particular system with a titling law,
Right.
what happens is that that particular the officer who is empowered to do the titling process, he can ultimately decide. Now everything goes to the court.
Yes.
So that should be changed. At the present set of conditions, as you pointed out, there is no system, no administrator can take a 100% perfect decision on the matter. So it becomes something like a very personal thing. So if I'm a corrupt officer, I can decide in the wrong person's name, and if I'm a good officer, I can take a decision in favor of the correct person. So that gives a scope for a lot of things. Lot of things, I won't say what is that. So that gives scope for a lot of things.
Yes.
What I will say is, ultimately, only the titling law will end all these dirty processes.
Yes. Very nice perspectives on why, again, we're emphasizing all along the titling law, and you give very interesting perspective. May I quickly request other panelists to also ask, although we can have questions at the end, but sometimes it happens that some of the panelists have to go off for something urgent. If that happens, we can just spend another 5 minutes interacting with Dr. Babu. Anybody else or participant, quick questions or comments? You're most welcome. Anybody? Any participants? Okay. If not, then I will thank you very much, Dr. Babu, and hopefully, if you can stay along, we probably can take questions at the end. May I? Okay, so I think there is a question here. Okay, so there is this platform. We are all getting used to the online platforms, and it's always a surprise. So we have a unique way. Is it possible to go for conclusive state guarantee titling system? We have a question from Shiva Kumar.
Of course. Can I answer now?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Please.
because already, like I mentioned before, the titling law cannot be promulgated by the union government, because there is some confusion on that. That is why Government of India had come up with a model land titling bill. That was way back in 2011, about 10 years back. So if Government of India brings in a model bill, it is the duty of the state governments to carry forward and enact something of their own. But unfortunately, no governments have come forward for doing so. Maybe because of so many issues. Again, coming to Kerala, we have almost a perfect system now, because every land transaction is digitized. We have a system called Release Revenue Land Information System. So everything is digitized in Kerala. All the transactions happen seamlessly. Still, I would say there is big scope for improvement. Big scope for improvement.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So I think Dr. Nivedita Haran, she is asking, how do you think, how do you link this to digitization of land records, as conclusive titling without foolproof data is risky?
Ma'am, digitization, of course, is a good thing, but only thing which we can avoid through digitization is manual work. Of course, if you can make a digitization perfect, definitely you can avoid the manual intervention. And manual intervention means it is money. So if you can remove that particular part, definitely it will add upon the perfection of the land titling. So ultimately, ma'am, digitization will not. It might help in land titling process, but that will not solve the problem of land titling. So only through land titling, we can solve the issues in land governance.
Yes, that's very interesting. I also took this up a while back when I wrote an article. I think it was printed in Mint, where I said that the distributed ledger systems which we are coming up with probably would be one thing to explore, where
There is another question: can digitization alone transform the shift from to conclusive titling? That is what I was about to tell.
Yes.
This particular digitization alone cannot solve the issue. See, every land transaction happens through two processes. One is textual change and a spatial change. Textual change means something like 2 + 2 is 4. And with that, there should be a sketch, a change in the sketch of the particular property. That should become 2 + 2 added upon to 4.
Correct.
So only when the textual and the spatial data speak to each other correctly, without any change or without any addition or deletion, then only it will become a perfect land record. So digitization alone, that will happen only in the spatial data, but textual data is also very, very important.
Excellent. Yes. So another question we have from Shiva Kumar: how will conclusive titling bill address customary or communal land rights and claims?
No, so we have excellent history with respect to this community right and all this. You may be knowing in 2006, Government of India came forward with the Forest Rights Act, And in that, excellently in Kerala, maybe when Niveda Madam was there, she was the principal secretary then. We have done it perfectly. Out of the entire states in India, we have done it perfectly. We recognize all the community rights of the citizens. I mean, especially the scheduled tribes in the state. So we like what Kerala has done in the case of FRC. We can easily do it for other parts of the state and other parts of the country. So recognizing community right is not a big issue.
Okay, excellent. The question, of course, will be that why it's not easy to do in other parts of the country, or why.
That I can explain. Because Kerala is different. Now, here we have more than 91 lakh operational holdings.
Yeah.
91 lakh operational holdings. And Kerala, the person who are landless in Kerala, it is maybe less than 1 lakh. You cannot imagine in other parts of the country.
True.
Now, we recognize people and we recognize their titles.
Correct. Yeah. I think there was another question, but maybe we lost the question. Oh, yeah. I think this will be the last question for our current panelist. So, as you can read, even with conclusive titling, there should be a mechanism to which all departments associated with land records should talk to each other.
No, see, these things, land records talking with each other, that's a very good system. In fact, in Kerala, what happens is we have introduced a system called RELIS, Revenue Land Information System. In that, what happens is if somebody wants to buy a property, he just need to go to the concerned village office. And from the village office, automatically the record of right, we call the Tandapper or Chitta, we say, that will automatically move to the sub-registrar office. The person, once he goes to the sub-registrar office, even that is online, but some people go to the sub-registrar office. Once they do the the transaction, that is deed transaction, then he just need to go to his home and he can sleep happily. Automatically, there will be a mutation happening in the back end in my office, in our office, that is revenue offices, and he'll be informed that your transaction is complete, and you just need to pay basically, and this particular property is in your name. So the departments should talk, but not offline. It should be online. It should be online in the back end, and that should seamlessly happen automatically. If somebody is given a privilege to control that, there ends the matter. Because every department feels like they are living in Antarctica,
Yeah.
So that should not happen. It should seamlessly happen at the back end, and no department should be given a privilege to stop the process. It should automatically happen, like we are doing it in Kerala.
Excellent. I think this is a very good model of convergence, kind of, you're talking about. So thank you very much, Dr. Babu. I'll now request Ms. Sushila Bhatt to kindly present her views and talk to all of us.
Thank you, Sri Ranjan Kumar Ghosh, and all the panelists and the Secretariat of ILDC for inviting me to this wonderful session, and on a subject which is very dear to my heart, because I was involved in land issues before the High Court with respect to issues that were of high consequence and a high level. So that gave me a perspective on the land issues that happen with respect to government land records, with respect to private players, with respect to judicial interventions and all that. A comprehensive view I could get due to my involvement. Actually, for this, I am thankful to Nivedita Madam and Dr. Sajid Babu also for helping me in fighting cases before the Honorable High Court as a special government pleader for revenue land. And my now concentration on the subject today is with respect to the conflicts that happen between land management, policy implementation, and practical issues that govern land. The main issue in land management in a particular state, I feel, is a bifurcation of powers between forests. Forest is also a land issue, revenue, then survey, and registration officials. So there is no uniformity of powers being exercised with respect to a particular piece of land between these various powers that be. And that creates lots of conflicts, which give room for lots of lapses, lots of manipulations, lots of fraudulent deals that happen with respect to a piece of land. So if we take the grassroots exercise of land management and governance, the basic land record keeper is the village office, as told by Dr. Sajid Babu. So if a person owns a piece of land, titling issue is also there, as he pointed out. The multitude of documents that have to be checked and satisfied to prove absolute ownership over a piece of land with vis-a-vis village office. The documents are multitude. There are 2 permanent records, 1 settlement register, then another register, then 23 accounts, 13 temporary registers, and various other records that are to be kept by a village officer. And one issue that we usually face is there will be a village officer who is in charge of all these voluminous records with respect to the land records, survey, then the nature of land, tenure of land, whether it's government land, whether it is leased land. All these aspects have to be kept and updated and taken care of. But the moment a village officer gets conversant with the particular records and particular piece of land and even the village corner by corner, he is transferred. The new incumbent comes. By the time he learns and he studies and gets conversant with the land records and all other this thing, again, it takes its own time. That casts a type of burden on the common man who wants something to be done through a village office, like getting a tax receipt or getting a possession certificate or getting any document relating to his identity or ownership of land. So that basic issue that a common man faces vis-a-vis village records have to be addressed at the highest level, or even through what you call, maybe digitization has helped to a maximum, maybe to a large level. But those issues where the keeping of registers and updation of all the data, which can be made available at the press of a button, has to be done at the grassroots level, even if it is the most rural area of our country, has to be brought under this system where it is foolproof data is available without any voluminous documents or voluminous records, which has to be gone through by the officials. So one aspect that has to be addressed during this, whenever some land policy is framed, that has to be taken care of. Then another aspect I would like to highlight is the litigation aspect. I am a lawyer. See, Shakespeare has, in one of his discourses, in one of his poems, had suggested, let us kill all the lawyers. I am a lawyer, but I'm not looking down upon my profession. It's a very noble profession. It is a very proud profession. But the aspect that a common man has to look into is the delays that is caused in courts whenever a litigation springs up. Naturally, when a civil dispute is raised, the hierarchies of courts that has to go through, it harps on his entire life, as suggested by Dr. Sajid Babu. It is generations to generations that litigation happen without an end or conclusion to his right or his redressal of his grievance. So that how to address that issue. See, one suggestion that usually crops up is you evolve a mechanism of mediation. Mediation by calling both the litigating parties and settling the dispute, so that in a particular way within a particular time, so that each party is satisfied and there is no further issue or further cropping up of appeals, revisions, then second appeals, and all these mechanisms or hierarchical delays can be avoided. So that has to be implemented with all the fervor or with all the vigor that it deserves, to avoid delays in litigation or a judicial way of delaying the redressal of grievances of common man with respect to his land. So another aspect I would like to highlight is there was a national land reforms policy that was promulgated at the center in 2013, which made it imperative for the states. Already there are land reforms in most of the states in our country, and Kerala is foremost in implementing this Kerala land reforms. It was a very revolutionary move from the state of Kerala in implementing Kerala Land Reforms Act in 1960s. And but one aspect while coming across the various litigations relating to land before the High Court, I found that the land reforms policies and implementation have a wide gap in such a way that common man's issue of getting land through land reform is minimal. Another thing is, there were so many loopholes in the Land Reforms Act legislation that big plantations, which had nothing to do with the ceiling limit, were holding lands without any limit and without any sort of control over their holdings from any corner whatsoever. So that created the disparity between the rich and the poor, and social justice was at peril because of this wrong land reforms policy. So that has to be addressed at the highest level, at the central level as well as the state level, to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor and the landless and the haves and have-nots, and eke out social justice in such a way that there is equitable distribution of lands to the landless, to the have-nots, and to the underprivileged, in such a way that the dignity of an individual, that he owns a land, is brought to reality. So that policy you can get from the net. It is only a draft policy. It has not seen any light of the day so far. So it is very pathetic that governments or state governments or central government is not very serious about this, where the bridge between the landless and those who have big landlords is not yet addressed, despite we have reached this 21st year of 21st century. So that is very pathetic. We have to address those issues regarding equitable distribution of land to through those who are landless, who constitute a big majority of the population of the entire country, is especially rural, the SC, STs, the underprivileged lots who are landless, who are eking out their livelihood on purumbokes or on as landless lots, whose problems have to be addressed through these land reforms legislations or policies that are to be implemented with all seriousness that it deserves. For that, there should be what we call willpower on the part of the policymakers, on the part of the legislators, and on part of even the judiciary. I would say that they should keep in mind the social justice principle enshrined in the Constitution, to see to it that have-nots are the questions, the issues faced, landlessness faced by the have-nots, are to be given priority whenever they address any issue relating to land. So with these 3 points, I would like to conclude. I am thankful to all the participants and the panelists and also the organizers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bhatt, for again articulating very nicely the broader contours of what the policy, the importance of bringing policy changes, especially with respect to bridging the gap between the landless and the those who are better endowed. I'll invite other panelists, all the participants, to write their questions, ask questions. But one thing before, as they do it, what in your own opinion, Ms. Bhatt, is a reason you think that such kind of a convergence has not happened, in the sense of, you say there is lack of political will. Is it only lack of political will, or is it also something like the difficulties in getting different stakeholders who operate under different frames to come together on such issues?
Yes, I would say, because the three organs of our constitution, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, if there is a coordinated attempt on the part of all these three main organs, main pillars of our constitution, these issues would have been addressed long back. We got independence in 1947. The idea of land reforms happened in 1960s. But we are in the 21st century, in 2021. But even now, the address of the issue of landlessness is looming large over our heads. Why? That is because of lack of willpower, lack of coordination, lack of even there should be a sort of implementative policies which are to be made mandatory, for those who are implementing such policies. And if there is no hard and fast rule governing the implementation of such land reforms policies, then even though there is legislation at the grassroots level or other levels, there will be holes where people will be have a lackadaisical attitude, and they will not be interested in addressing such issues. And as you say, as we see, the loss delays, the long litigation pending with respect to a small issue before the various courts, all these contribute to that lack of, and that makes the implementers, who even if they want to implement, a sort of course, this is going to end up in a court. Why should we bother about it? That type of attitude. So that lack of willpower and lack of implementing mechanisms which are to be strictly followed, that is lacking in our system.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? As Pranab is saying, we can also write our questions in Q&A or in chats. Any immediate questions to Ms. Bhatt, or we can come back to her later also if needed. So if not at the moment, then thank you very much. I will now invite Mr. Sumendranath to, he's a technical consultant, advisor, architect, and works with the Karnataka State Natural Disaster Monitoring Center for your views and contributions to this.
Thank you, Dr. Ranjan Ghosh, and thank you to the panelists and organizers, ILDC, for inviting me. So, as Dr. Ranjan Ghosh mentioned, so I'm a technologist. So I will view this topic from purely a technology point of view. So when I saw this topic, bridging the gap between policymakers and the research analysts at the ground level. So what I could make out was that there is a lack of common ground. That is why there is a gap, right? So how can technology aid in bridging this gap is what I will try to address. So as the esteemed panelists before me mentioned, there is a growing population and right utilization of land is imperative. And to address landlessness, to ensure that there is ownership, clear titling ownership, there is a reduction in case pendency, and also protecting the environment to ensure that the land is land which is ecologically fragile is under the forest department. So when we look at bridging the gap between the policymakers and the research analysts or activists or citizens, the policy making is a top-down approach. So policies are done by the policymakers. They implement, they frame the policy. The administration implements the policies, and the citizens see the ground reality. So it's a top-down approach. The research analysts, activists at the ground level, they take a bottom-up approach where they try to understand the ground realities and provide a feedback loop to the policymakers. Now, the administrators strike a balance and try to balance the policy and with the ground realities and implement it to the best of the abilities. So what is the common ground which is missing? So that is one area where technology can help. Wherever legal matters have to be solved, it should be solved legally. Wherever the technology matters have to be solved, it has to be solved technologically. So my focus will be on the technology part, as I mentioned. So the common ground which can be solved will be with accurate and authentic data. I think that is one thing, if available, it can set a ground for discussion for very effective decision making. So when I say accurate, it should be precise, and when I say authentic, it should be from trustworthy sources. So any policy, so today if we are talking about presumptive titling, that means that data can be inaccurate, data can be inauthentic. So any policy which is drafted from an inaccurate data is inherently flawed. So that could be one reason why there is a gap. The accuracy and authenticity has been my focus areas when in my work with the government, be it disaster management, be it election commission automations, and even the civil works monitoring, which I've done, where I've tried to connect the field reality with the policy making, so that there is enough feedback loop for a very crisp and effective decision that it gets taken either at a state government level or a central government level. So in this, technology can be a game changer in bridging the gap using accurate data. So when it comes to data accuracies, like Dr. Sajid Babu sir mentioned, that just digitization is not a solution. I can scan a paper document and call it a digitized copy, but that doesn't solve anything other than the fact that I can send it through email and it can be made available for viewing. But can I process the information within that document? Can I link to multiple sources? So the data at a ground level, once we use technologies, modern technologies like GPS devices and satellite images. So GPS devices these days are very low cost. They are very available for everyone, and they are very, very advanced. And we have very sophisticated maps available with ISRO, like a Bhuvan database. Bhuvan maps are available. So the surveys, once they are conducted using GPS and satellite-based images, it gives accuracy and authenticity. So that is the first point which I want to make, is that the data should be accurate and authentic. The second point I want to make is that the data should be well structured in a digital database. So as the panelists before me mentioned, there are multiple departments. There's a revenue department, the survey department, there is the registrar office, which and coordination is required between all these departments, so that the title deeds are based on presumptive basis. So to make it conclusive, from presumptive to conclusive titling, data should be from a single source. So, so it is okay for multiple departments to exist and do their own with their own powers, act according to their privileges, but the data can be from a single source, so that it can be available instantly. So if there is an update by the registrar office, it should be instantly available to the revenue department, and so that data should also be linked to the survey department. So the textual information and the graphical spatial information with GPS tagged information should be merged, and there should be a single source of data. And I'm sure that Kerala is also very making good progress in this. So I would like to also give an example of Karnataka, where there is a Bhumi framework, where the survey records have been digitized, and there is a Dishank app which is functional in Karnataka, where if I stand with my phone, a GPS-enabled phone, at any location, the phone will capture the GPS, and then it can instantly give the survey number of that location. So it is proven that with such devices, we can link multiple sources of data, multiple departments, and it can be made instantly available. BBMP also, which is the municipal body of Bangalore, it has digitized information and made unique IDs, and with the good intervention from the officers, there was an additional revenue of 400 crores which was clocked by BBMP, because they were able to identify violators very easily. Once the boundaries are GPS tagged and identified, you see overlaps, you see encroachments. So these can be very easily be identified. Even at the central government level, very good steps are being taken, like Digital India Land Record Modernization Program. There is Swamitra, which is a drone-based system. So again, drone-based, we can use drone-based technology where the drone can survey based on boundaries which are marked, and it can GPS tag the information. So, but one critical thing is that there are some things which should be enacted by law. For example, if these can be enacted using legislation, then this standardization and structuring can happen, can be put in place. The third, when I mentioned standards, that is the third aspect which I wanted to mention. So there are various terminologies which are, since these laws are different across states, and this land matter is a state subject, significantly a state subject. So there are different issues in different states, different solutions are required in different states, but at least the representation of land information, the terminologies, the way the land data is structured, at least that part can be standardized. So if there is a standards body which can recommend not only the way the land records are stored, but also how the research, if an organization is doing research on the land matters, if activists are on the ground, even if they can provide structured feedback. So as I mentioned, this is a bottom-up approach, which means that these organizations should provide feedback to the policymakers with structured information. So currently, a lot of research is done on paper. There are reports which are available, summarized reports which are available. But if this feedback can be structured and provided to the policymakers, better judgments can be made, or at least it can be evaluated. If a policy is not framed right, there can be enough data to prove that the policy can be improved. So a structured grievance redressal system is what I'm coming at. So in addition to putting technologies in place to digitize land records, to integrate land records, textual information with the satellite information, there should be a very structured grievance redressal system where the citizens, the activists, the organizations at the ground level can provide feedback. And that the reason I'm saying it should be structured is because the issue should be well classified. And the fifth point which I wanted to make is regarding the integration. If a technology is well structured, it can also be well integrated. So just like Aadhaar is a system for identifying the ID of a person. Similarly, the Aadhaar is also attached to bank accounts, PAN is also attached to bank accounts. So there is an integration because the system was designed such that it's very well structured enough to be integrated. So if there is a very well structured integrated technology available, the identity of the owner, the bank accounts of the owner, mortgages which are available, encumbrance certificates, property tax registers, claims, survey maps, history of transfers. So all this have to be integrated into a single platform. And most important thing which the panelists before me covered are the court cases and litigation. This is something which usually is overlooked when it comes to system integration. It is possible to actually integrate court cases into the system so that if there is a claim or if there is a conflict in a particular land, it can be addressed. And the court case, when it okay, I want to make a point regarding the court cases also. So if as Dr. Sajid Babu and Advocate Sushla Bhatt mentioned, that there are a lot of cases which are pending in the courts of India. There could be 1 crore court cases which are pending, and out of these 1 crore cases, it's not that they're all different cases. They're all cases of similar nature. So if there is a high court judgment in one state, or if one high court gives a judgment for one particular case, that judgment can be applied to all the similar cases. So if the court cases are also attached into the system, then it can reduce the pendency to a great deal. Because and it will also avoid multiple courts giving conflicting judgments, then going into Supreme Court and then trying to resolve all those conflicts. So so what I wanted to say is that a very well structured digitized system with accurate, authentic, geo-stamped imagery information, strengthened with feedback mechanism and integrated with all stakeholders. This is the system which is required. It may be conceptual at this point, but I think there needs to be a start thinking about such a system, so that we don't wait for pendency of court cases to actually solve all the issues. So such a system holds the key, and it also opens multiple doors, because once we have this sort of a system, we can identify lands which are underutilized, which are unutilized, and there can be better foresight while making a policy. Like Advocate Sushla Bhatt mentioned, that there are plantations in Kerala which are exempt from land sealing, and it could be possible that the plantations are using just 10% of the lands. So that means that 90% of the lands are just left unutilized in this age, when there is a population problem and land resource problem is there. So maybe those 90% land can be redirected towards forests for ecologically fragile lands, and rest can be given for agricultural lands and the landless to stay. And I can't avoid this topic of
if you could also conclude in a couple of minutes, so that we have
yes
we can
I'm
come to questions.
sure.
Yes. Thank you.
So say I can't talk about technology without talking about artificial intelligence. So I would like to make just 2 points on that. One is that once we have a digital structure in place, it gives a lot of scope. It opens doors for artificial intelligence. So mistakes in documents can be identified, correcting names, survey numbers, overlapping, identifying forged deeds. See, there are deeds which are 100-year old. So maybe with the image-based AI, they can be used to check overwriting, differences in handwriting, so that the forged deeds are also identified. So I would conclude with that and not take much of our time. Definitely, I feel technology is a game changer. I've tried to present as many points as possible within the time on how technology can be used. So hopefully, I've addressed.
This was very, very insightful. Very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Sumindranath, for highlighting the role of technology and it being able to bridge the gaps and bring that common ground. So I'll request others to ask questions, give quick comments before we move to the next presenter, because we have another 40 minutes or so. Okay. Yes, Dr. Babu, please feel free to log off when you have your next engagement. Thank you very much. If there are some last points you'd like to make before you go.
Yeah, just one point.
Yeah.
We have been discussing about so many things, so many issues, but we are not focusing on the land governance literacy part. Land governance literacy part. Well, most of the officials, they come and go from the land governance sector. But the land governance literacy, that should be given a focus, a major focus. Because mostly what happens is that there are a number of laws on land. And nobody can be a proficient in a tenure of maybe 20, 30 years. Nobody can be a proficient. But the basic things should be taught in the governance system.
Yeah.
There is a famous legal maxim called ignorance juris non excusat. But ignorance of law is not an excuse. But what the government is doing to make the citizen learn the laws on land, we are not doing it. So why can't we introduce a system wherein they see if a revenue officer, his as far as Kerala is concerned, his jurisdiction ends near a point of a cane, which is put up by the Forest Department. After that, it is governed by the Forest Department. That is under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. And coming to the collector, a collector cannot rule everywhere. After the seashore until the 12 nautical miles, he doesn't have any power, even though there is part of India or the state. So such kind of things, nobody know what is a cadastry, and what is a cadastry, and what is a cadastral limit, and what are the powers of a district collector in a cadastry, and what beyond. Those things are to be taught in the system, and even from the maybe not at the preliminary level, maybe even at least at college level, there should be some land governance literacy part in our curriculum. Then one more thing, in India, if you check the sites or if you Google, you will find that in the entire world there is not even a single course on land governance. What you can find is only certificate courses there, that in Netherlands. No other country, no other state is offering a course on land matters. So what we are doing is, I'm director of Institute of Land and Disaster Management now. So we are going to offer an MBA in land governance from our institute. So that will be done soon. So we already approached Amity University and Kerala Agricultural University for their recognition, and we are at it. So definitely we are going to do it, and we are doing our part on this aspect. Okay. Thank you. My miss is coming to my office at 2:30, so I have to leave. So if somebody is having any questions to me, they can ask.
Yeah, last minute for questions to Dr. Sajid Babu, pointing out very strongly the need for education on land governance. And also good luck to you for starting this initiative on education and literacy and land governance. And,
thank you, sir.
And hopefully we should talk.
And somebody was asking whether these laws are so complicated, you cannot read and decipher. I won't say understand, decipher. Decipher land law. So what we should have is we should have n number of manuals. To make it very, very understandable thing. You have to make manuals. What I would suggest is every state should come up with manuals on each and every land manual. If there is an engrossment, what should be done from A to Z? It should be given as a manual. If manuals are created on laws, then it will be very, very easy. That is my suggestion.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Babu. Let us know here at IIM if there is something we can do to help in this great initiative of yours.
Yeah, I'm so happy. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So I'll come back to Dr. Sumindranath. Probably, we'll take some questions on you collectively at the end, because we have, and you can see the questions which are coming to you on the chat box. And maybe you can take this one from Dr. Nivedita as I invite our next speaker, Mr. Harichandran. And after that, we'll have Ms. Suma Mundali, and we have half an hour to go from here. So I'll request you to probably summarize your views in 10-12 minutes each, and so that we have 10 minutes remaining for overall discussions and questions. Mr. Harichandran.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Please share the screen. Good afternoon, everyone. I thank the organizers for giving me a chance to explain the various methods of land scam committed by the government officials. At about 1.27 lakhs of complaints related to the land are unsettled for years in Kerala. More than 5,000 hectares of public land has been misappropriated on account of these land records. The Department of Registration and the Revenue are acting in an organized manner. Unfortunately, the software developed by NIC is helping the officials to commit the scam. Purpose of registration is destroyed, and the certificates and documents issued by the registration department are not reliable. Mutations are being cancelled illegally by the revenue department and land tax are not accepted from the genuine owners, landowners. Thereby, the genuine owners are forced to register illegal deeds. Resurvey documents, including FM sketch, field measurement sketches, are conclusive documents, and the alterations can be done only by the district collector or civil court under special circumstances. But resurvey documents are altered and are put in use without any authority. NIC has developed the software for both revenue and registration departments. As per information received under RTA Act, both of the softwares are put in service without any certification by the competent authority. Coming to the software used by the revenue department called as Release. This is the user dashboard available in the system. There is a provision provided for applying for resurvey corrections, which is against the law. The landowners are tricked into submitting application for resurvey corrections. There are several instances and several methods adopted for committing land fraud. Due to the limitation of time, I am presenting only 4 modes of fraud which are adopted all over Kerala. This is a case in which the victims are an auto driver and a manual labor. This is a certified copy of the deed number 2565 of 1992, registered in favor of Sri Kurian against old survey number 221/13B. It can be seen that the area transferred is only 18 cents against one survey number. Whereas in the encumbrance certificate, it can be seen that 2 more survey numbers are seen added. Thereby, records for 12.5 cents of land was fabricated by referring area of land in survey number 252/7B, which was not existing in the deed. In this stage, the area of land held by Kurian was increased from 18 cents to 30 cents by fabricating the records. In the next stage, the area of land held by Sri Kurian was increased to 35 cents. This was done by Tahsildar by cancelling the mutation of 3 innocent landholders who are held land in subdivision number 156/3/1, 156/3/2, and 156/3/3. Tahsildar also ordered the innocent landowners to register another deed by showing another survey numbers, namely 156/2 and 156/6, which is illegal. These innocent landholders are residing in the same land but are ordered to register a deed on land which is laying at a faraway place. The innocent landowners have appealed against the order of the Tahsildar, but the RDO confirmed the order of the Tahsildar by ignoring the facts. The complaint made by the victims are remain unsettled for years together. This case shows how documents are fabricated digitally in the sub-registrar's office. The encumbrance certificate pertains to land in survey number 90/11/1, whereas the deed number 536/2014 executed in this survey number does not pertain to this land. That is survey number 90/11. Further, the deed is shown as having no pages, that is 00. There should not be. And the area of land is not ended. This shows that the software has provision to enter values at the whims and fancies of the officers and also to edit the same at a later date. This type of encumbrance certificate has been obtained from various sub-registrar offices all across Kerala, showing that this type of scam is widespread. This case shows the fabrication of documents for public land by tampering the records of innocent landowners. This type of scam is done in different stages and is an organized crime which reveals the criminal nexus existing between the registration and revenue department. This case was done for facilitating illegal quarrying. This is an encumbrance certificate pertaining to the land in survey number 419 and 27. The document number 1468/1993 shows that this land was divided into two and Srimati Shobhana Kumari held land 15.78 hours of land in subdivision number 499/27/1. This is the encumbrance certificate pertaining to land in survey number 499/27-2. Even though Srimati Shobhana Kumari held land in subdivision number 499/27-1, the same was transferred to 499/27-2. Also, the area of area of land held by Shobhana Kumari was reduced to 12.95 hours from 15.78 hours. The details of a single document are shown differently in the two certificates, which shows that the digital entries can be manipulated through the software. It can also be seen that page number of the documents have been tampered and additional entries have been made without specifying the area. The same certificate also shows two court attachments against the liability of Sri Baiju, but Sri Baiju is not holding any land in subdivisions as on the date of attachment. It can also be seen that area of subdivision number 480/24 have been also inserted into 499/27-2 manipulations. This is a certified copy of the scheduled property pertaining to one of the court's attachment. Lands located in two subdivisions are shown together and shown as having the same boundaries, which is impossible. This is clearly shows that the court attachment itself is a fabricated. In the first stage, we saw how area of 499/27-2 was increased. In this stage, we will see how the increased area is transferred to government land in subdivision number 480/24. This is the encumbrance certificate pertaining to subdivision number 480/24, which is a Puramboku land. This fabricated court attachment is shown within the area of 480/24, which was imposed in the 419/27-1 initially. Then the court attachment was shown to be lifted and 31 hours of land was illegally credited to Sri Baiju in this subdivision. Thereby, records were created for 31 hours land against government land. Deed number 204/2015 is executed by Sri Anil to Sri Saiju. But Sri Anil has executed the deed against various other subdivisions, and the area of those subdivisions have been accommodated into 480/24, which is in fact government land, which is against the existing rules. You can see that various other subdivisions are shown against 480/24. This cannot be accounted against Purambok subdivision number 480/24. As per the index register maintained in the sub-registrar office, the records maintained on the basis of subdivision, and the area can be entered against the concerned subdivision only. Hence, the area of 18 other subdivisions have been shown in 480/24. 5 such similar deeds have been executed by 5 different persons in favor of Saiju by showing the same subdivisions and areas. In short, the same lands were shown to be sold by 5 different persons at 5 different times.
Mr. Chandran, could we move towards last minute or so that we have Yes, thank you so much.
The effect of the 5 illegal deeds have been summarized and are shown here. In the total, 948 hours of government land have been misappropriated and quarrying is carried out. Okay. The case related fabrication of records for government land, which is actually water bodies and wetlands. This is a very common method adopted across almost all villages in Kerala. The first step is issuing of land tax receipt against the name of person who does not hold land. Using this land tax receipt, further records are fabricated. This shows that the land tax was accepted from Lulu International against 4 subdivisions against a total area of 282 acres, that is 2.822 hectares. However, the information in the release shows that these lands are not owned by Lulu. Another copy of the land tax receipt. In this also, Lulu is not having any land in this subdivision.
Yeah, I think we are getting a sense of the different types of frauds which are there, and thank you very much for running us through some real examples and for us to see and understand. So I will have to ask you to stop, although it's very, very interesting and important, because we have another panelist, final panelist, and then we can again come back, sir, to discussion and have some questions for all of us the last 10 minutes. So may I request Ms. Seema Mundoli from Azim Premji University to please come in and be the final panelist here, but present your views and point for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ranjan, and thanks to the ILDC for inviting me. I have a very short presentation, just a few slides. So can I share my screen, please?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
May I also, in the meantime, request participants to write their questions either in the Q&A or the chat box so that we can quickly go through them and the panelists can answer them at the end of this presentation.
So you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So I know that till now the speakers have spoken very much about keeping in terms of the laws and the violations of it and the difficulties of looking at land. But since the session is about administration and research on land matters or bridging the gap, I'm going to talk about it from the base in the context of the research work that we have done, which focuses around mainly around cities, the sustainability of cities, and looking at the aspect of social justice, which also some of the speakers spoke about. So normally we've heard a lot about the difficulties of titling land, but this is more of a way of thinking about land itself, especially in the context of cities. So we know that land is either seen as private land, which is owned by individuals or businesses commonly, and public land, which is owned by the state. Both, in a sense, have their limitations of use, or they are exclusionary. Of course, private land is private, it is held by individuals, and that by nature it means that it can be used, accessed by only certain people. But when it comes to public land, for example, parks or any recreational sites or urban forests, again, there comes a certain exclusionary element because of the way it is seen. So, to give a very quick example, if you go to a park nowadays, you see a whole range of prohibitions. Yes, smoking, alcohol prohibition, maybe that's all fine. But then you have, I have seen a park next to my house which said children cannot play in it. You can't sit here, you can't walk there. Then there are also other exclusions in the form of timings or gating, fencing, which keeps out a whole range of people who may have traditionally used that space. And also by timings, you have only, like, you can go from 7 to 9 or 7 to 10 in the morning, and again 6 to 8 in the evening. So these tend, even though it is a government land, a public land, it tends to be a little exclusionary, and in that sense something like a private model. So how do we then have an alternate view of land? How do we see land that is state land or public land? So one of the frames that we have used is to look at it in terms of ownership as urban commons. So what we mean when we say by urban commons is that these are lands that may be owned by the state. They can be revenue lands, mainly largely held by the revenue department. They can also be managed by different government departments. So I'm currently, our university is in Bangalore, and based on our work, we have seen that lakes, for example, they are within the municipal boundary of Bangalore, but they can be owned or they will be managed by different government departments. It could be the forest department, in some cases it's the fisheries department. Similarly for parks, sometimes it's the horticulture department that has the management use. But all these lands, whatever they are also used by a whole range of communities around them, and they are also cared for by these communities, which comprise both original residents who are from that area and new migrants. And when I say migrants, I mean from different socioeconomic class. They could be from the IT to the wage earner who comes from the villages. And these, while these seem as what we mean by these urban commons, and this is just an example of these multi-use commons that we have been looking at. There are ponds and wells in cities, water bodies, forests and groves, cemeteries, parks, and even the avenue trees that you see on the side of the roads. So these are just to, and we've used a framework of ecosystem services to look at, what do these spaces that are public / owned by the government provide for people. And very, very quickly, if you're looking at an ecosystem services framework, that is, what are the benefits that these provide? And here I'm just looking at two benefits that citizens normally use: the provisioning and the cultural services. So when we say a particular piece of land, be it a park or a lake or a forest or a cemetery even, they have these range of services that local communities access. These are all pictures from our field work and with our interactions with people in different cities, mainly largely from Bangalore. So you can see that these are used for grazing, collecting fodder. The lady in the blue sari is actually collecting a green soppu or a green leafy vegetable from the lake bed, which she uses to cook. There's grazing that happens. The other lady who you can see sitting shelling some seeds, when we spoke to her, she said that her daughter works as a domestic worker in the house, in one of the high rises, near the IT park, and she comes with her daughter. And because there are a lot of pongamia trees, she collects the seeds, dries them, and they get oil out of it. Similarly, there are other activities which are done in all these areas, which provide some kind of a benefit to the people, not only as food. They also they're a way of earning income. So cemeteries, are example, are one of the sites we've seen. There's a lot of grazing that happens. The other is the cultural services, which we see as recreational spots, lakes as recreational spots, trees as sites of worships, and fun and games. I mean, many of us would know how the Gulmohar. This is just one example of how we use Gulmohar petals to play. Children play a lot around these kind of spaces. So mainly, when we're talking about land in the city, what we have seen is that yes, there is a public and there is a private that we all recognize, but perhaps there is another way of seeing land in our spaces in the cities, which is moving away from this binary and looking at it as commons, something that is multi-use, something that recognizes the multiple relations that we have land. And yes, of course, there are challenges with the governance of this kind of land, but there are also examples that we have been talking to and engaging with. One is the Chennai Resilience Center, which is looking at this urban horticultural initiative in schools, in lands in slums, and especially during the COVID period, they did this. There's also this one of the things that we were thinking was, okay, so we have all this land in the cities which we are terming as common land. What can you really do about it? So if you're looking at the problems in India today, you would say there is issues of employment generation. There's also issues of environment. So we had written this policy paper talking about an urban employment guarantee scheme, looking at green jobs. What kind of green jobs can you have in cities, and what are the kind of jobs that people can do? So like the MGNREGA, it has a daily wage component, but there could also be this apprenticeship component for people graduates who are not able to get a job, who can access this scheme and build their experience. And there are existing employment schemes already. Kerala has the Ayakali Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme, and post-COVID, recognizing the employment crisis, Odisha, Himachal Pradesh, and Jharkhand had also initiated employment generation schemes. But the Kerala scheme has a lot of potential because it combines employment and it combines the environment. And from what we have seen, it is used by some of the people who need the most help. And in some panchayats, in some municipalities like the Neyatikara municipality, there is this huge use of this public, or what we term as common lands, for including in schools, etc., for vegetable cultivation. So this is something that we say that there is a lot of land in the cities that can be viewed as this. Of course, we know water bodies, wells, wetlands that can be used for environmental regeneration work and for all these ecosystem services that we mentioned, but also these non-conventional spaces below flyovers, buffer areas of airports, in educational institutions. So whatever we have seen from our research is that maybe what it requires is, yes, the laws and the legislations, but also a different way of looking at land if we want to make the most of it. And since our concern is environment, ecology, and employment, urban guarantee schemes could be one way of doing it. And the existing schemes, there could be a lot of tweaking that can be done to ensure that this happens. So I'm sorry I rushed, but I realized the time was very short, so I've just skipped.
No. Thank you very much. I mean, in a very short time, you really brought back attention to a very important form of, a property, which is the commons, and the need towards, and you also said, you gave very nice pointers into operationalizing, common property rights and how they can be, the commons can be managed. So thank you very much. I will now, in the interest of the remaining time, open the questions not only to you, Dr. Mundoli, but to all the panelists here, because we have 5 or few odd minutes remaining. So I request all the participants to have a final round of question or discussions or your opinions. And I think we already have a question pending for you, Mr. Sumendranath, from Dr. Nivedita Haran, where she is asking about the inequity, potential inequity from technology. So do you want to take that?
Yes,
question?
yes,
Yes.
yes. Good afternoon, madam. Thank you for your question. So the question is creating new inequality because of technology. Yes, actually, technology is a tool, and a tool can be used or misused. It depends on who is using it, and it depends on how it is designed also. For example, as Mr. Hari Chandran had mentioned, if somebody has designed a system where the data can be tweaked, of course, land can be transferred with even less effort than on paper. So yes, so in that way, it is very important to first design a system which is in today's terminology, it is called as a trustless system. So something like a blockchain is a trustless system where you don't have to depend on an intermediary. So you don't necessarily have to trust a person or an organization. So a blockchain is one of the solutions by which it's a distributed ledger where there's a participation from citizens, from various public organizations and the government, which own a collective database. So it is very difficult to go ahead and change an entry in a blockchain unless everybody comes together and says that we'll change it. So that makes it very difficult. With respect to the socio-economic inequality, I would also like to mention one more point, that authentic data will give rise to, will open up new channels by which we can know where there is inequality. If there are unutilized, underutilized lands, it can be distributed to landless people, because the economic situation of any individual will rise as soon as he owns a land. So that is one area where technology can help. But definitely it should be used in the right way, with right spirit, with proper political will and administrative resource. So that's my quick comment on that.
Yes. No, thank you very much. So I'm also in parallel posting my views on that, which I wrote a while ago for everybody to see. I think I very much agree that the distributed ledger system is where we are heading towards a safe data management system. But very quickly, I think Dr. Nivedita Haran is also commenting that Mr. Hari Chandran's presentation is a good eye opener, and also Mr. Shivakumar is again coming back to you, Dr. Sumendranath, in terms of the data from single source standardization. I think we'll come to you back, but maybe before that, Mr. Harichandran, what would be your response to what Dr. Nivedita Haran is saying, and also what if you could give one or two very quick solutions, because you have been working on this fraud issue. What do you think would be potential solutions apart from the digitization, of course, in your view?
The proper supervision must be there.
Mm-hmm.
In this digitalized system, nobody has examined the working, and there was no trial run as conducted. Without conducting the trial run, this was introduced for day-to-day use. This is this software, making the software in a perfect system is not a difficulty one, because we are going to moon. That means we can separate the system, but only things the interested peoples and dedicated peoples are required to implement the system. And another thing, there is every provision provided in the software to manipulate the data and to grab public lands. This is the main reason.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Harichandran. So, Sumendranath, would you like to come back to this question of the cost? Basically, is that going to be a barrier in implementation of such solutions?
In my opinion, I think the cost should not be given that much priority, because we are already losing enough resources because of the pendency of court cases. There's so much of confusion in the country. If you estimate the cost of time lost, effort lost, and the resources to manage paper-based system, I think one-time cost for digitization can well be justified. I don't want to put a figure into this because I'm primarily an architect, and it should be the implementation company which should be giving a cost and estimating the cost. But in general, digitization is worth it. Digitization in the right spirit, putting all the pieces together and ensuring there's a robust system is well worth it. It has proven in all aspects in governments, not only in land. So I don't think cost should be considered as a factor.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So you're clear that cost won't be a factor, and what I can just chip in with the fact is that technology has probably a high capital cost, high fixed cost, or a development cost. But then once it is developed, you have the variable costs of operations are not very high, and you can really operate at a very low cost level in that sense. So it's eventually going to be low cost solution.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah. So because we are now on the hour, in fact, crossed it. I think this has been a very, very intense and very important, session. So research on the irrelevance or limitation of so-called presumptive land rights. I think that's one final question. If somebody wants to take that before we, end this session. Thank you, Nivedita Madam. I think we have to now end this session. If somebody wants to take this up, is Pranab around? Pranab, if you want to take this last question, the research and limitation on the limitations of presumptive land rights. I think this is a very large topic, and of course there is a lot of research from from whatever my standpoint is, and we should definitely keep on having such sessions, such discussions. I would like to thank all the panelists, all the participants for making it a very interactive, useful session. Thank you to the organizers for bringing us together, for giving us this platform and opportunity, and bearing the the time required, the cost in terms of the time required to do this, for this very, very important, noble, collective thinking that we all, are joined to, together with. So thank you very much, all the panelists again, and hopefully we can, carry on with our contributions. We can be in touch and take it beyond this particular session. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your
Thank you for your
participation. Thank you. Varsha, is there a way to end this? What should be done? We are all not very, maybe